G'day and welcome back to the shed. Tonight we're going to take a look at John Scalzi's The Redshirts. When this novel came out, he won the Hugo in 2013. And for those of you who don't know John Scalzi, he was a former president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. And that's the guys who are responsible for the Nebula every year. So John's been around, and he's also a pretty prolific blogger. And he also played consultant to the television show The Stargate Universe. So he's a pretty influential science fiction author who's definitely played a big card in especially when it comes to our Nebula award-winning ladder here. So I've got to begin with tonight's review and say that this review may be a bit biased. I'm a huge Star Trek fan. I've always been a huge Star Trek fan ever since I watched the first Star Trek, the original series, the repeats on television. I've just been hooked, and I've watched all the franchises, and I just love the show. So keep that in mind as we review this book, because the whole Redshirts in the novel really plays on that trope that we find in science fiction movies and television shows of the 60s and early 70s. So it plays right into that card and has a bit of fun and pokes a bit of fun at some of those cliches in those novels. So keep that in mind. I don't think it'll sway our leaderboard here that we've got going, but do keep that in mind as I talk through this novel. So John really explores the idea in this novel of what happens if someone's science fiction television show could alter someone's reality. And that's sort of really what the whole novel is about. So look, it's a very enjoyable book, one that I read when it first came out in 2012. Before it actually won the Hugo. Actually, I remember reading the book before the Hugos came out, and I was pleasantly surprised and happy to see the actual novel win. So the book begins with something straight out of a movie screen, and it appears that you're reading a script for one of these 1960s, 1970s movie script. And then the actual novel itself begins, and we're introduced to one of the main protagonists in this guy called Andy Dahl. And Andy is a xenobiologist, and he's also a alien religious expert of some sort. And they've been enlisted to the Universal Union's flagship starship in the Intrepid. I can never say that properly, Intrepid. And it doesn't take Andy long to realize that whenever he's on the deck or one of the officers walks by, the rest of his shipmates just all sort of disappear. And he's not quite sure what's going on here and why they all seem to be avoiding the officers. As Andy gets acquainted with the rest of the crew, he sort of quickly realizes that whenever there's an away mission, someone comes back dead or doesn't come back at all, right? So, and it seems to be happening all the time, and it's never really affecting the officers. And there's only one officer who's actually injured during some of these away missions, in a guy called Kerensky, who's the lead astrogator, which also doesn't sort of make sense to Andy, because he's trying to understand, what's an astrogator doing on an away mission to look at some alien bacterial disease that's crippling some kind of settlement on this remote planet. Typical, and playing on those tropes, those cliches that you saw in the things like Star Trek, the original series. So Andy and his shipmates are pretty confused, and they're sort of getting nervous. They're not quite sure whether or not it's through incompetence or whether or not they're just going on dangerous missions, given that it is the flagship ship of the Union. But they're all sort of rather getting edgy, and his shipmates, like I said, they're just ignoring him and trying to sidestep him. And when problems do come up, like he's sort of scratching his head, because he'll come up as a xenobiologist. He has to find this cure for Kerensky. Otherwise, he's going to die from this alien plague-like symptoms. And his crewmates basically say, hey, put all this data into this magic black box, and somehow it magically spits out the solution. And he's reading the solution, and it makes absolutely no sense. But he walks over to the bridge, gives it to the captain, and the captain sort of looks at it and goes, oh, well, of course, blah, 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 blah. And off they go, and the world, and Kerensky's saved, and they've saved the settlement planet, right? So all this bizarre, very cliche, what you expect to see in a 1960s or 70s television show of the era. So this is sort of puzzling Andy for quite some time, and he sort of tries to confront his shipmates, and they're sort of very vague and they're very dismissive. Until he meets a pretty hairy guy, not too dissimilar to me, in this shipmate called Jenkins, that's been hiding through the air conditioning ducts and through all little passages and nooks and crannies of the airship. And he's got a very bizarre theory as to what's going on. As bizarre as it is, as implausible as it is, it's sort of the only thing that sort of makes any sense. So they take Jenkins' words and travel back in time to try to resolve their current conflict. And I don't want to say more than that because it's just fun, I think. It's just a real fun novel. And some of you who know Star Trek probably can put two and two together. But I think it's just a wonderful show, wonderful novel that is... It keeps you guessing, I must admit. You're sort of not quite sure what's going on. And not in the sense that it's a puzzle in any way, but you're sort of just waiting for that punchline, and it delivers. I believe it really does deliver on many occasions, both in the enjoyable plot, both in the humor. You know, I found myself chuckling more than once out loud, reading the book at night, keeping the missus awake, because I just found it really entertaining, light reading, a whole lot of joy, and one of the, you know, when it comes to our Hugo and Nebula award-winning ladder here, one of the funniest, if not the funniest. Actually, honestly, I don't think there is a funnier book on Hugo than what we have in John Scalzi's The Redshirts. So I don't think that John Scalzi was being serious in the novel, and I think he was, you know, poking fun at himself and the industry as a whole, specifically that 1960s and 70s genre of television shows, with a bit of light humor, not taking yourself too seriously, and even some of the science fiction that he brings into that alternate reality. He doesn't try to explain it away. He basically explains it away just as those 60s and 70s television shows, as in, hey, it doesn't make any sense, but neither does quantum physics, and who's to know that quantum physics is not just a whole lot of mumbo jumbo by some screenwriter somewhere, right? So it's got that element of fun in it, which I really did enjoy throughout the whole novel. And some of the puns are quite obvious, and you know, they make you chuckle out loud, like I said. And some of them are a little bit more in your face, but overall, it's a light-hearted, whole lot of fun. So yeah, look, a very entertaining read, a very fast read. It won't take you long at all to read it. I've read it on my Kindle, so I can't recall how many pages the book actually has. But, you know, it took me just a couple of days to read through the novel. It flows really quickly, which sort of takes me to some of the criticisms, if you like, and they're very light criticisms. I really did enjoy the book, where, you know, the characters are pretty shallow. They're of the same cut, really. But they're fun. They're fun characters. I don't think they were supposed to be taken too seriously. They're not overly complicated or complex characters. You get what you see or what you read with these particular characters. I would have liked him explore Jenkins a little bit more, and maybe, you know, I thought Jenkins was probably the more interesting of the characters. But he also didn't play the major role when it comes to some of the away missions and things like that. So I thought Jenkins was a pretty interesting character. But the rest of the shipmates, they were okay. Like they were fun characters, but I wouldn't call them deep or complex in any way, shape or form. Now, previously on this channel, when I reviewed This Immortal by Roger Zelazny, I sort of said that, you know, part of the dialogue, when you go through pages and pages of dialogue, and I sort of sat on the fence as to whether or not, you know, the dialogue itself was great, but I found myself sitting on the fence because Roger Zelazny wouldn't say who's talking. So it would just, you know, have a whole lot of text followed by quotations and a whole lot of text, quotation, text, right? And you never really knew who was talking. You know, Zelazny didn't give you any indication of whose actual order of talking, who's speaking in a dialogue, which is sort of very contrary to what you get in this book. I almost got tired of, you know, and Dale said, and John said, and Jenkins said, and Dale said, and Jenkins said. That was a bit off-putting, so I wish there was a bit more of a blend. Somewhere between, you know, Zelazny and Dale, I think, is the nice middle ground there. But look, that's a very mild criticism. It's just as I was reading through the book, it took me back to Zelazny's. I thought, you know, there is something to say about Zelazny's dialogues, right? But look, that's a very, very, very mild criticism. I found it a little bit distracting at times. I just thought, like, I know who's talking. You know, I don't need to be reminded literally every single breath. But that's a very light criticism. And the dialogue was fun. And that's, I think, one of the beauties of this book is that the dialogue is a whole lot of fun. The interactions between the different characters in the novel is a whole lot of fun as well. So I was surprised to find that it's been 10 years, at least 10 years since I read the novel. It's probably closer to 11 years because the novel was really fresh in my head. Like, I didn't really forget the concepts. And I think that's got largely to do with the fact that I'm a Star Trek nerd, right? I'm a big Trekkie fan. So that may have something to do with it because I've never been able to see Star Trek in a similar light. Whenever I see, you know, especially the original generation or the original series rather, and the next generation for that to some extent, whenever I see someone on the bridge with a red shirt, I'm always going back to John Scalzi's The Redshirts and thinking, oh, is this the guy who's going to get popped in this particular show? So the idea and concept has stuck with me like you wouldn't believe. It's so fresh up in my mind that when it comes to the memory test, there's probably very few novels that have had that impact on me as far as recalling. Every time I watch a show, I recall John Scalzi's Redshirts. But I do feel that may be swayed by the fact that I am a Star Trek fan, right? I don't know if it would have the same impact if you were not a Star Trek fan. So keep that in mind. But for me, it had a pretty lasting impact. But what I will say is this. The concept was strong, the concept of the red shirts and what happens within the novel. So that stayed with me. The plot, to some degree, has stuck with me. But going back to, you know, the minor criticism I had about the characters, I could not recall any of the characters, right? Which I think talks to the depth of character that I was referring to earlier, because it's just not there. The characters, as fun as they are, and I like the interactions between them all, they're just not memorable characters. Not like Conrad, for example, when we read This Immortal, you know, strong character. Same with when we read To Your Scattered Bodies Go, with those, you know, non-fictional characters in the mix, memorable characters, you just don't forget them. So different, right? Strong concept, a fun novel, weak characters, interesting plot. So yeah, look, it was a very enjoyable read. Shall we go to the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder here and rate this one? Let's do it. So back to the Shed Ladder and ranking John Scalzi's Redshirts tonight. So interesting one, this one. Where shall we begin? Maybe we start with Ringworld. And the reason that is I think the concept of Redshirts is one that really spoke to me. I really got the concept, really enjoyed the concept, and the plot was fine. There was nothing wrong with the plot. I enjoyed the plot. But the concept of Redshirts is what I really enjoyed, which I think is why I want to start with Ringworld, because that in some ways was similar for me. The concept of the Ringworld was such a great concept and why it rates where it does. But there are some things in the plot, some of the characters I didn't care for too much, or not that I didn't care for, but they had some limitations, let's say. So I think it's a good sort of midway point to start with John Scalzi's Redshirts. But look, having said all of that, I don't think, as much as it's a strong concept, I love the concept of Redshirts. You can't beat Ringworld for a concept, right? That Ringworld concept and the hard sci-fi in there really shaped a generation of writers, and I don't think Redshirts has had that kind of impact, at least not yet, and I don't think it will have that impact for the years to come like Ringworld still does today, right? So, you know, strong concept. I can't put Redshirts above that. There's just no way. The Demolished Man is such a well-written book, you know. Every time we go through this board, I always just am reminded just how good Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man is. Some really interesting concept, timeless concepts. And as much as I enjoy Redshirts, I don't think it's going to rate better than Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man. But look, having said that, right, if this was how funny are these books, this would be right up the top there, right? Like off the board. It is the funniest of the Hugos. I really can't remember any of the Hugos being as witty and as clever and as much fun as reading John Scalzi's. So I highly recommend it. Actually, I forgot the recommendations, right? Geez, I'm being forgetful tonight. So who would I recommend Redshirts to then? If you're a Star Trek fan, you really will enjoy John Scalzi's Redshirts. I'm almost convinced of that. If you're looking for a light-hearted, good, light-hearted humour that may have you chuckle out loud, I don't think you'll be disappointed in the Redshirts. So highly recommend it to all the Star Trek fans out there. Yeah, I think, and anyone who likes sci-fi, right? It's got an element of time travel in there. So if you like time traveling novels, I think this will also appeal to you. But don't look for hard science, right? The science, they poke fun at the science through this novel all the way through it, and they don't try to rationalize it either, which is a lot of fun. For me, what made it really fun. So yeah, the recommendations there. Sorry, I forgot to say. It's definitely a Star Trek nerd like myself will enjoy it. And if you're looking for, a time traveling novel that doesn't take it seriously, that is a nice, fast read, light, fun book, you won't be disappointed in the Redshirts. So yeah, I won't rate better than Demolished Man though. Flowers for Algernon and the Redshirts. Flowers for Algernon is a much better written novel. Let's just say that. You can't rate these two in my mind. Flowers for Algernon is a much better book than what Redshirts is. Characters are fine. I hate doing this to Flowers for Algernon. But I'm going to say Redshirts is, for me, when it comes to the Hugo and Nebula award-winning ladder we got going on, I'm going to rate it above Flowers for Algernon. But am I convinced? I might not yet be convinced. Let's just skip that. Let's put that down as a placeholder. Flowers for Algernon, Babel 17. A lot more memorable. I enjoyed the book from beginning to end. So definitely better than Babel. So it's definitely going to be between those two, right? Flowers for Algernon and Redshirts. But now I'm going to stick it there. It's locked in. Let's lock it in. And the reason we're going to do that is because I've said it multiple times now with Flowers. It's a wonderful novel, but there's not much science fiction in Flowers for Algernon, or fantasy for that matter. Like I've said it time and time again, Flowers is really just a great piece of fiction. Absolutely wonderful piece of fiction. And one of the weighting scales here that I'll use is, the science fiction concepts themselves. How strong, how memorable are those concepts? I love Flowers, but I'd say Redshirts is a stronger concept. And you're also talking about time travel. You're talking about, reconciling time streams and what's the effect of that. And I think even though they didn't try to take it seriously, it's for a whole lot of fun. Flowers are brilliant. I mean, I say this every week. I'm going to put myself on record and just press play. They're all fantastic books, right? That's why this is difficult, why it's not always easy, why I'm always conflicted when doing it. But yeah, I think I'm going to back Redshirts there. So yeah, we've been all over the place. The 60s, 70s, 2010s. Who's to say where we're going to go next week? I guess hit the like, subscribe and notification bell so you won't miss out. Thanks for joining me in the shed. I've been Peter and this has been the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time in the shed.